Live from the slightly twisted deck bar, it's the Poojie Podcast with Justin Lemie.
Want to welcome on Chris Kirschner, the beat reporter for the Atlanta Hawks for The Athletic. A friend of mine from here in Jacksonville, but great to have you on, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
For sure. How's everything going up there in Atlanta? I know times are wild right now in sports, so how are you kind of handling everything and still doing your job to the best of your ability?
I mean, it's really no different than what I'd be doing for the month of April anyways, because the Hawks only had 20 wins. They had the fourth worst record when the season was suspended by the league. So they weren't making the playoffs. So I was already anticipating having to do off-season coverage as soon as 2 weeks from now. Their final game was going to be April 15th against Cleveland. So I knew, once Game 82 came, that the season was over because, again, they weren't making the playoffs. So, the off-season for me just started a month earlier. So you just have to do off-season content, have to rely on your relationships with the players, agents, executives, coaches to help you, get content. It's nice working for The Athletic because we have several national reporters who you can also rely on to help you with coverage, whether it's the draft, whether it's just the national outlook for the Hawks. So it's really no different than what I'd be doing anyway related to the Hawks, just because, again, their season was going to be over in 15 games when the season was suspended.
Gotcha. Well, that makes sense. Yeah, I didn't realize basketball season was over so close to when this all started, but makes sense. And I guess the turnover from the regular season to the off season with free agency and the draft and everything, I guess working for The Athletic, how closely is that more of your marquee time? Are you more focused on the off season, or is it pretty much just all Atlanta Hawks all the time, 12 months a year?
Yeah, it's Hawks 12 months a year. What's nice about covering the NBA is it is essentially a 12-month sport. August is probably the month that's dead, just completely dead. There's nothing really going on because in July you have summer league and free agency. August, it's the month before training camps open in September. Even the month of September is pretty dead because training camp usually starts that last week in September. So there's really nothing going on. But, yeah, I cover the Hawks 12 months a year. For a team that like the Hawks, who's obviously rebuilding and looking ahead to the future for when they, eventually become a contender, it's always a future outlook for what I'm doing. So the games themselves necessarily really don't matter because they're likely going to lose that night. It's just a matter of them going through a rebuilding process for the past 3 seasons now. Next season, they are hoping to get to the playoffs, and the head coach Lloyd Pierce actually said that a few weeks ago that he believes the Hawks are going to be a playoff team next season. So it's always been in my 2 seasons now covering the Hawks, it's always been looking ahead to the future of what they can become.
Gotcha. And I guess from your standpoint, I know you're close with some of the players and everything just from working so close to them. Does it seem like they have the right pieces in place for the future? Or I guess in your opinion, where do you think they could improve or what would you do if you had more of a say in it? Where are they at?
Yeah, I think right now they have, the pieces they definitely want on the roster long term. They have a franchise point guard in Trae Young, who's an all-star starter in his second season. They have a power forward in John Collins, who averaged 20 and 10 this season on historic shooting splits. But by the time the season ended, he was shooting over 60% from the field, over 40% from 3, and 80% from the free throw line. Those numbers haven't been seen before in the NBA. And then they have 3, solid role players right now. Kevin Huerter, a shooting guard, Cam Reddish, shooting guard / small forward, and DeAndre Hunter, who's a small forward and power forward. I think it's too early to say whether or not they have the right pieces in place just because they don't really have that much experience right now. Definitely it hurts a little bit that the season ended just so they can get an additional 15 games in just to see what they can look like. They traded for Clint Capella from Houston, who's going to be their center long term. He was working through rehab for plantar fasciitis. So it would have been nice to see what he could have brought to the lineup when he was healthy. But right now, I think they have the pieces. They just need to add, more talent and more experience because it's such a young roster.
Gotcha. Yeah, that totally makes sense. It seems like basketball is like that in a lot of ways. There's teams that can kind of make that jump pretty quickly just by getting one or two pieces here and there. But I know you mentioned that the records haven't been the greatest over the past 2 years that you've been there, but anything stand out or any particular moment stand out in a game that you were at, a cool ending, a nice buzzer beat or anything like that?
This season, Trey had a 50-point game against Miami where he just completely took over. They won that game against the Heat. It was funny because they had just a awful ending earlier in the season against the Heat on the road in Miami. Trey, I forget the exact specifics now, but I don't remember if they definitely had a lead earlier in the season. And Trey went like this, like it's over. Like after he made a shot, there was like a minute left. Miami ended up winning the game, and Jimmy Butler, just one of the biggest trash talkers in the NBA, obviously had to get the last word in. And then fast forward a couple months, Trey scores 50 against the Heat, and then he has the final say. So, I mean, those moments make the NBA really cool because there's a lot of trash talk in the league, maybe more so than any other sport, at least publicly, especially on social media. The NBA players are super active. So that game stands out. The last game before the season was suspended. It could be potentially Vince Carter's final game because he's retiring at the end of the season. So if the NBA ends up canceling the rest of the season, that was his final game. He got in overtime against the Knicks and made a three, which is probably going to be his final shot. So that game sticks out. The day Kobe Bryant died, the Hawks were actually playing. Kobe's daughter, Gianna, who was also on the helicopter with her dad, her favorite player was Trae Young, and Trae, when the game started, came out in the number 8 jersey. He usually wears number 11. Before the game, there was a lot of emotions with Trae. He went over to his mom and was crying in his mother's arms. That day was a really surreal moment because a lot of players, especially younger players, grew up idolizing Kobe. Trey was no different. John Collins, who we just talked about, no different. One of his favorite players was Kobe. A lot of these guys just grew up loving Kobe. So that day was really a surreal moment. But those 3 games in particular stand out this season.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up about Kobe. I mean, obviously that's a difficult topic, but I guess you being on the front lines in the NBA, kind of wanted to hear your insight on that. So I'm glad you touched base on that. And with how emotional you said it was, that definitely resonates throughout the league, and not only the league, but the sports world altogether. So, but I know you said you've been there for 2 years. Before the Atlanta Hawks, where were you? What were you doing? Were you in sports? How'd you kind of get your start in journalism? How did you know that this was your calling?
Yeah, before I was with The Athletic, I covered Alabama football recruiting for a couple years with Cox Media Group and SEC Country. So with that job, I was just tracking down all the players that Alabama was interested in just for football, and just calling them up, seeing where their recruitment stands. It's nice not having to track down high schoolers anymore. I mean, it could get really annoying just because you're talking 15, 16-year-old kids about where they're going to school. One moment they like this school, one moment they like the next school. I mean, it just changes so often. So it could really be a pain. But it was cool because I got to go to a lot of the Alabama's games. I was at 2 national championships. I was at the Alabama-Georgia game where Tua threw the 2nd and 26 pass to Devontae Smith for a touchdown to end the game. I was at the game where Deshaun Watson found Hunter Renfrow in the corner at the end of the game for Clemson's win. So, I mean, there's been cool moments with covering Alabama just because of how dominant they were. Several playoff games, just several electric games in Tuscaloosa. I was at the Iron Bowl a few years ago where – forget the specifics now, but Auburn ended up winning the game and they stormed the field afterward. Got hit in the face with a caution sign. I don't know how a fan a fan just like was waving a caution sign around and hit me in the face, and just blood was pouring out of my face. But I mean, like, those moments are cool. Like, that's college football. Like, college football is, I mean, in my opinion, it's the most exciting sport to watch. So yeah, I was there for a couple of years before coming to the Athletic. Before that, went to Florida, was a sports anchor for the campus television station, did some radio stuff there. Graduated in 2014. Had some internships along the way. In Jacksonville, I worked for Channel 4 for a summer. My senior year, I was working for WABC, the local TV station in New York City, my senior year. Just various other things. I mean, I mainly started getting into journalism. I think it was eighth grade or ninth grade. It was when math started getting really hard. Shapes and letters started getting involved. I was like, this is not for me. Because before that, I wanted to work for NASA. I really liked the space program and all that stuff, and that was what I really wanted to do. And then, obviously, if you're working for NASA, you have to be really good at math and sciences, and I just wasn't. I was always a really good writer. I liked to read growing up, so I also really like sports, and sports and writing seem to go together, and that's how I ended up here.
That's awesome, definitely, to kind of follow that passion to where you're at and kind of identify through grade school and everything where you want to be. So that's cool to hear. And I know you mentioned, obviously on the recruiting trail for the SEC now. I know obviously a lot of the best talent in the country goes to these SEC schools. Now that you have firsthand experience in that, how is recruiting just a completely different bear when it comes to the SEC? Was it a lot of like battles between, LSU, Alabama, Florida, Alabama, Auburn? Like, how did all those schools kind of interact with each other? Were there any, interesting recruiting stories for one player? Just kind of tell me a little bit about that with those 4- and 5-star athletes that go to those schools.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot, especially covering Alabama, because Alabama is not only recruiting against schools like LSU or Florida, Auburn, or whatever. They're also recruiting against Clemson, Oregon, schools around the country who are the biggest programs. So it's definitely unique to cover, because you're sometimes talking to kids who live in California who are interested in Alabama. I got to go to Hawaii for a week because Tua is from Hawaii. That was really cool. I wish they recruited more players from Hawaii. It's just an interesting team to cover, because they also cycle through coaches a lot, because a lot of their assistants, Nick Saban's assistants, are coveted by schools around the country. They think if he knows the secrets for why Alabama has been so good for over a decade now, so maybe we should hire him. So with that, like, recruiting changes so often for Alabama, because a lot of the times recruiting is all about relationships. And if you're an assistant coach for Alabama, you take the job at Texas Tech, I might have, if I was a recruit, I might have a really strong relationship with you, and you're gone now, and now I don't have any sort of relationship with the coaching staff. So it's just always changing. For Alabama, they're obviously recruiting the best of the best high school players in the country. And they start at an early age. Like, some of these guys get offers in 8th grade if they're super elite. I mean, Dylan Moses, their linebacker now, got his offer from Alabama in 8th grade. And a lot of these players are getting offers in 9th grade, 10th grade. So as a reporter, like, you have to start building relationships with those players, because, when they are seniors and about to go to college, if they've known you for 3-4 years, they're obviously going to trust you at that point, and they're going to tell you the truth of what exactly is going on. So I mean, especially for that, recruiting is all about relationships.
That's awesome. That's, really good insight on that. I don't think a lot of people know just how in depth some of that recruiting goes. They look at it on a few different websites and see a few stars next to these players' names, and they think it's that simple. So
it's much deeper than that.
Yeah, right. It is. It's a lot. It's got to be a lot deeper, but that's how these big programs stay big and become dominant. So that's awesome. And I know you mentioned you went to Florida. You covered Alabama. I guess my last question for you, more of an opinion question. Out of the teams in the SEC, which one do you feel doesn't identify the most with the SEC? Which one, if you had to remove one from the SEC, which one would it be?
I mean, Vanderbilt is obviously the worst athletically. They have a really good baseball program. Football and basketball is usually really bad. But they are the best academic school in the conference. I never really understood, I mean, I get it because the SEC wants a lot of money, but like Texas A&M and Missouri, I just don't really see them fitting in with the rest of the SEC schools. If I had to remove one, I would probably remove Missouri just because, again, I just feel like they're so far removed from just the history of the SEC, because you have the blue bloods like Alabama, LSU, Florida, Auburn. Those schools have been around for years now. I just don't feel like Missouri and Texas A&M, I just don't feel like they have much of any sort of ties to the current SEC programs. But I mean, Texas A&M's obviously had a lot of football success, especially lately. I think they should be much better now with Jimbo Fisher. But they just don't have the history as the other schools. So if I was removing one of them, it'd probably be one of those two.
Gotcha. Yeah, I feel like a lot of people say those two. I think baseball and academics definitely holds up Vanderbilt, and Missouri, coming from the Big 12, I think it was, just doesn't have too much history with the SEC, but I guess the TV market and recruiting base does it for the SEC, and I guess that's the trick. So,
and that's a big part for Texas A&M, because you add Texas A&M, and Texas is obviously gigantic in high school football, and just having an SEC program in Texas, gets those Texas kids who might have been looking at Big 12 schools like Oklahoma or Texas or Baylor or whatever. Now you have an SEC school in the state of Texas, and it probably opens up the eyes of those high schoolers, like, oh, like Texas A&M plays in the same conference as Alabama, LSU, and Florida. Like, maybe I should start watching more of their games instead of Texas, Oklahoma, Baylor, Texas A&M. So I definitely understand the recruiting aspect of it all, like adding Texas A&M.
Do you think college football is going to get played this year?
I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, it just seems like every single day there's something new with the coronavirus, and just how fast it's spreading and how many people are dying. I don't know how, soon sports are going to get back, whether or not the NBA is going to continue their season and go straight to the playoffs or resume part of the regular season. I really have zero idea of what's going to happen. I think if it does come back, say in August or July or whenever, I just can't see any way that there's going to be fans inside these buildings, just because, especially in these college stadiums, some of these college stadiums hold over 100,000 people in it. If you're having 100,000 people, packed in and standing this close next to each other, I mean, that doesn't seem smart from a health standpoint, just with how easy the virus spreads. So if it does come back in these next few months, I just can't see a way that there's any fans in the building.
Gotcha. Well, no, definitely appreciate all that information, Chris, and thanks for jumping on here and doing this. And I hope everything continues to go well for you up in Atlanta, and I hope the Hawks improve a little bit so that you can be covering them in the playoffs here in the next few seasons. All right?
Thanks a lot.
All right, Chris.